from New York area? New York, New York. See, I go on cruise ships and I got a cross section of people. Like, one's from British Columbia and somebody else will be from Texas. Somebody else will be from Oklahoma. So it's kind of interesting to see the cross section of people.
Sure.
But it's a hometown crowd here. The last hometown crowd I had was in Lake Worth, Florida a couple weeks ago. I was doing a talk at the Atrium, and there were 21 people there. 19 of them were from New York. Half of those were from Brooklyn. You know where Brooklyn is? I said, do you ever go to Juniors? Yes. Oh, we love Juniors. Juniors was so good. There were 2 people who were from Massachusetts, and their daughter ran the place. So that was the last time I had a hometown crowd like this. So hopefully we'll get going shortly in about 3 minutes. And I take it all except for my daughter-in-law. We're here in 1968.
Yeah.
Yes.
All remember
Yes.
1968.
I remember it well.
I've done this about 11 times, so I'm going to be telling you facts as you know them, and also stories from people who I've met along the way, including a woman from Bratislava, Czechoslovakia, who was at the Prague Spring in 1968. And her story has been documented by Steven Spielberg because she was one of the Raoul Wallenberg survivors. She and her mother, too. The rest of the family was wiped out, which I learned subsequently after I got to the Prague Spring. And during that talk, when I was talking about the Prague Spring, she said, oh, it was beautiful. And being that my background is journalism, and that my best part of my whole repertoire is actually interviewing, I told the people in the audience, I said, listen, she and I are going to have a little private conversation, but I'm going to have my microphone with me, but there's going to be nobody up there. So if anybody from the cruise ship comes and says, where's the speaker? Say, he just disappeared, he just met somebody from Bratislava and he wants to talk about the Prague Spring. And I'll tell you the story about the Prague Spring as she saw it and as somebody else who I ran into saw the same thing, the Prague Spring and the end of the Prague Spring. Good evening. You're all in the back. Except you.
This is like school. It's like school. We don't want to be called on.
You're on the back, so I can stand here.
Yeah.
If you
I'll
want.
stand here.
If you want.
This way I don't need a microphone. And we'll get going here. I'm going to give you my background. My name is Evan Weiner. I've been a journalist since 1971. I started when I was 15 years old up at WRKL Radio in Mount Ivy, New York in Rockland County, and I was also working for the Journal News. And basically what I was doing was 2 things. One, I was kind of covering sports for the Journal News, which was a separate entity than the Journal News that you see today. That was the Rockland entity. It used to have things like the Daily Argus on this side, and then they merged and got rid of all the local newspapers. And for WRKL, I was doing something called Tiger Talk, which was a bunch of high school kids telling you what was going on in the high school. It wasn't a very good show. In fact, it was a terrible show, but that's how I started. I was around in 1968. I was 11 and 12 years old. My first big break in the business was in 1978, March of 1978. I was up at the Tappan Zee Townhouse in Nyack. And the Democrats used to come there, and the Republicans used to go to South Orangetown. And they used to have their fundraiser there. In Nyack, they had their fundraiser for the Democrats. And John Lindsay stumbled in, and I do literally mean stumbled in because John was kind of drunk. And I'm 21 years old, and I've never met John Lindsay before in my life. Of course, for those of you who don't know, here's the mayor of Gotham City, right? Mayor Lindsay. Anyway, he walks in and he puts his arm around me. I never met the guy. And he says to me, I like you and I'm going to tell you something. I hadn't even introduced myself to him yet. I introduced myself to him. He introduces back, I'm John Lindsay, and I'm going to be running for Senate as state of New York in 1978. And with that, I ended up on WNEW AM. Remember WNEW AM with William B. Williams?
Yeah.
And all of that, and before I get going, I'll tell you a William B. Williams story if you want.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, remember Ava Gardner?
Yes.
Okay, so one day William B. Williams is on the air, and he's playing record after record after record, whether it's Nat King Cole and Frank Sinatra and Peggy Lee, Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, you remember the format up there. And record upon record is played, and the general manager of the station saying, wait a minute, did something happen to Willie B? I haven't heard him. He said, but then again, the engineer's there, so I would know if something happened. But I'm going to go in there and see. And he goes in there, and William B. Williams is on the phone. And he says, who are you talking to? He said, I'm talking to Ava Gardner in Europe. He said, oh, good, good, good. Tell Ava I said hello. The general manager walks out of the place, goes back to his office, gets a pair of scissors, puts the scissors in his back pocket, comes back in, and he looks at William B. Williams. He goes, snip. And William B. Williams looks at him and said, you just cut off Ava Gardner. And the general manager said, I'm paying you to play records and talk in between the records, not to talk to Ava Gardner. Although talking to Ava Gardner probably wasn't a bad thing. Anyway, getting back to the 1950s, where Ava Gardner was back then, and talking about 1968, let's connect the 1950s to 1968 and Edward R. Murrow. And Edward R. Murrow taking down Joe McCarthy. Now, in my career, I was fortunate enough to know Don Hewitt, who put together 60 Minutes. And Don Hewitt, when the movie Good Night, Good Luck came out back in about 2002, which was produced by somebody you might know, is a friend of mine named Mark Cuban, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, and Shark Tank. See, if I tell Mark you didn't know him, he's going to get very upset. His ego won't allow it. Anyway, Don was at the opening, our opening, for one of my press clubs about Good Night, Good Luck, and started talking about Edward R. Murrow, and started talking about the night, the Alcoa Hour, if you remember when he took down Joe McCarthy, and he said, it started real journalism on TV, and it ended real journalism on TV. Now, Murrow did two things. He did Person to Person, which paid the bills, and the Alcoa Hour, which was Edward R. Murrow, Grapes of Harvest of Shame, and all the other little things that Edward R. Murrow would do. William Paley owned CBS, and William Paley freaked out at what happened with Edward R. Murrow and Joe McCarthy. Murrow basically took him down. And Paley decides, running CBS, to keep an eye on Edward R. Murrow and try to defang him if he could. And he would by 1960. I don't know if you remember, the last thing he did in the 1960s was the Harvest of Shame about the California migrant workers.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, William Paley, and Paley comes back in 1968. And this is why I'm setting this up. He comes back in 1968, but in 1960, he decides he's had enough of Edward R. Murrow, and he calls Edward R. Murrow and Fred Friendly, who was his partner, Murrow's partner, and says, we are taking over editorial control of everything that you are doing, which includes the Harvest of Shame. Edward R. Murrow said, that's done. You're not touching that. That's done. In fact, he said, listen, I am going to promote it out of my own pocket. I am going to take out ads in the New York Times, ads in the Herald Tribune, ads in the Chicago Tribune, ads in the Los Angeles Times, saying, watch this show. It would be the last time Edward R. Murrow did a show on CBS. William Paley had that kind of power, and Paley would come back 8 years later.